So if you want to know why a civilization is about to collapse, you really shouldn't look at the barbarians at the gates.
Right.
You actually need to look at the spreadsheets in the capital city. Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at a translated lecture on this really foundational ancient text.
Specifically Surah Al-Qasas, verses 57 through 61.
Yeah, exactly. But, and I really want to stress this for everyone listening, we are absolutely not reading this as some sort of theological sermon.
No, not at all. If you treat this text purely as, like, religious poetry, you just completely miss what it actually is.
Which is what?
I mean, it is a masterclass in macroeconomic network failure. And, well, civilizational survival. It is entirely a socioeconomic diagnosis.
Right, because we are so conditioned to view historical collapse through this lens of morality, I guess, or divine retribution.
Yeah, and when we do that, we completely gloss over the cold, hard mechanics that are actually being described in the source material. Like when a society falls, it is the absolute definition of a mathematical inevitability.
A structural failure.
Exactly. It's a structural failure.
Okay, let's unpack this, because what is so fascinating to me is how this text diagnoses the root cause of that failure. It essentially exposes the absolute oldest lie in the political playbook.
Oh, the ideological mask.
Yes. We see this all the time, right? When an entrenched elite faces any kind of systemic reform, they immediately claim they're resisting it to protect our sacred values or preserve our traditions.
Right, they make it about culture.
Exactly. But the text we're analyzing today just completely strips away that lie.
It really does. It actually records the literal core objection of the elites in that specific historical context. We are talking about the Quraysh of Mecca here.
Okay, so set the stage for us. They are confronted by a reformer, and what do they say?
So verse 57 documents their exact argument against establishing a more equitable system. They say to the reformer, if we follow the guidance with you, we will be snatched from our land.
Snatched from our land.
Right. The Arabic term they use in the text is nutakataf.
Okay, wait, I have to push back a little bit here just to get the context right, because the Quraysh were a deeply religious society, right?
Yes and no.
Because they housed like hundreds of idols in the Kaaba. So are we completely dismissing their religious fears? Like, is the text arguing that their theology was specifically designed just to justify their economy?
That is such a crucial distinction to make, actually. We really cannot look at their religion through a modern, personal, sort of spiritual lens.
How should we look at it?
We have to look at the geopolitical reality of late antiquity. So at that time, you had these two massive superpowers, the Byzantine Roman Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire. And they were locked in these constant, devastating proxy wars.
Just burning everything to the ground.
Exactly. And the Arabian Peninsula was situated right between them. So it functioned as this critical but very dangerous trade corridor.
Okay, so where does Mecca fit into a war zone?
Mecca was essentially a designated neutral zone. And those 360 idols in the Kaaba, that wasn't just a spiritual pantheon.
What was it?
It was a geopolitical United Nations.
Oh, wow. Wait, really?
Yeah.
So every time a different tribe placed an idol in the Kaaba, they were essentially like signing a non-aggression pact.
Exactly that. It was a trade treaty masquerading as a shrine.
Hmm.
The sanctuary of Mecca was this universally recognized safe zone where absolutely no blood could be spilled.
Which makes it the ultimate free trade hub.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
And because the Quraysh managed this sanctuary, they held a total monopoly on safe transit.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they could send their massive trade caravans north to Syria and south to Yemen in winter and summer without any fear of being raided. And why? Because they held the geopolitical keys to the sanctuary.
So their theology was basically the legal framework for their economic dominance.
Precisely.
Man, okay, that completely reframes the conflict for me. Because when the reformer comes in and says, hey, we need a system based on universal justice, equity, and, the dismantling of these artificial tribal privileges.
Right. He is essentially telling them to tear up their exclusive trade agreements.
Exactly. So when they reply, we will be snatched from our land, they aren't talking about being conquered by an army at all.
No.
They are talking about market eviction.
That is the exact mechanistic weight of the word nutakataf.
Nutakata.
Yeah. It means to lose one's footing, to be violently uprooted by forces you can no longer control. Or, I guess, in modern economic terms, to suffer catastrophic capital flight.
Wow.
They are explicitly admitting in the text, like, we know your proposed system might be more just, but if we level the playing field and democratize security, our exclusive monopoly just evaporates.
We lose our VIP status in the regional economy.
Exactly.
I mean, they sound exactly like modern corporate executives terrified of anti-monopoly laws.
Very much so.
It's like a telecom giant saying, well, if you break up our monopoly to make the internet cheaper for everyone, our market share will be snatched away. It's pure economic self-interest.
It always is.
But why couldn't they see the broader picture? I mean, wasn't it somewhat rational for them to fear losing a monopoly? Because monopolies are highly profitable.
Sure, they are highly profitable for a very small node in the network.
Right.
For a very short period of time. But they are mathematically suicidal for the network as a whole. And what's brilliant is that the text doesn't respond to their fear with some spiritual platitude.
Like it doesn't just say, oh, blessed are the poor, you'll be fine.
No, it hits back with a purely macroeconomic counterargument. The immediate reply in verse 57 is a rhetorical question pointing to empirical reality.
What does it ask?
It asks, have we not established for them a secure sanctuary to which the produce of all things is drawn as provision?
Okay, let's break down those terms.
Yeah, so the Arabic terms are hardaman amanan, which means a secure sanctuary, and risk, which is provision, or basically economic resources.
So the text is forcing them to analyze the actual root cause of their own wealth. It's like saying, look at your own ledgers. Why is wealth flowing into Mecca in the first place?
Precisely. What the Quraysh failed to realize, or, well, purposely ignored, was the causal relationship of their prosperity.
Right, the wealth wasn't there because they were somehow tribally superior.
Or because they had exclusionary practices. The wealth was there purely because of the security of the sanctuary.
The harem.
Yes. The text isolates the fundamental variable here. A rightly ordered, safe space with predictable rules naturally becomes a gravity well for global resources.
Because capital flees instability.
Exactly. Capital flees instability and it aggressively seeks security.
You know, it's like the Singapore or Switzerland model of the ancient world. Capital doesn't flow to those places today because they have like massive oil reserves or natural resources.
Right.
It flows there because they offer regulatory predictability, physical security, legal stability.
And the text is pointing out that if you expand that order, if you establish true systemic justice across the board, it doesn't destroy provision. It actually stabilizes it.
But the elites in this text are just completely trapped in a zero-sum mentality.
They are. They operated under this incredibly superstitious belief that wealth is just a fixed pie. And if others gain security, their own slice would naturally shrink.
Which the source material calls the tyranny of unproven assertions, right?
Yes. The whole "we will lose our economy if we reform" objection is just a massive failure of analysis. They just dress it up as prudence.
They falsely assume that justice and prosperity are mutually exclusive.
Which is absurd when you actually look at the data.
Let's test that assumption, though, because, I mean, it's a very sticky fear for a reason. You hear it today whenever there's a push to raise wages or, you know, fix a broken healthcare system.
Oh, constantly.
People always say, oh, it will kill jobs. It will cause massive capital flight. Why does that specific excuse work so well across literally millennia?
Well, it works because it preys on a very fundamental human fear of systemic instability. But let's look at the actual mechanics of what the Quraysh were doing.
Okay.
They were acting as heavily armed toll booth on the only safe road in the entire Arabian Peninsula.
Right.
So they believed that if every road became safe, if justice was universalized, no one would use their specific toll booth anymore, and they would be ruined.
Because they'd lose their captive audience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But basic network economics tells us the exact opposite is true.
Right, because if every road is safe, the trade volume across the entire network just explodes. The overall wealth of the region increases exponentially.
Yes, the pie gets massively larger.
Sure, you can't charge a 500% markup at your one little toll booth anymore, but you are now operating in an economy that is 10 times larger and vastly more resilient.
But see, they were willing to stunt the growth of the entire geopolitical region just to maintain their relative advantage.
Which is insane.
It is. And the text exposes this not as some sort of unavoidable economic necessity, but as a fatal flaw in systemic design. Systems built on localized hoarding and exclusionary privilege are incredibly fragile.
They require so much energy just to keep the walls up.
Constant, exhausting expenditure of energy just to maintain the artificial boundaries that keep competitors out. But systems built on equitable security, they are robust because they actually align with the natural flow of human cooperation and resource generation.
Okay, so If expanding justice and leveling the playing field actually doesn't cause a society to collapse, if that's just a myth peddled by elites to protect their monopolies, what actually breaks the system?
That is the big question.
Because we know from history that these massive wealthy empires do eventually fall. So what is the trigger?
And that logical transition brings us right to the core of the text's diagnosis. The engine of civilizational collapse is not external enemies.
Okay.
And it is not a lack of resources either. The actual mechanical cause of ruin is the hoarding of wealth and the creation of artificial systems of distribution.
Artificial systems.
Yeah. To understand this, we have to look at a highly specific linguistic point in the source material regarding the word kufr.
Okay, let's definitely spend some time on kufr, because if you look at a standard traditional translation of this text, kufr is almost universally translated as disbelief or infidelity. And I think when a modern analytical listener hears that, they immediately tune out because they just assume it's ancient religious tribalism, like, believe in my God or you're a bad person.
And that theological flattening completely destroys the actual socioeconomic utility of the word.
So what does it actually mean?
In this specific context, the root meaning of kufr is entirely mechanical. The literal root of the word means to cover up, to conceal, or to bury something.
To bury something.
Yeah. In an agricultural context, an ancient farmer was literally called a kafir because he covered the seed with soil.
Okay, wait. How does covering a seed translate to the collapse of a macroeconomy?
Well, when the text applies this concept to resources, using the phrase kafarat bi'anomila, which basically means covering up or acting ungracefully toward the provisions of the system, it is describing the act of hoarding.
Oh, wow.
It's taking the capital, the resources, the technological potential that are meant to circulate through a society and burying them in a vault. It is the deliberate act of covering up the equitable distribution of wealth so that only a hyper-concentrated minority benefits.
So the parallel is that kufr isn't a crime of thought at all.
Not in this context, no.
It's an economic bottleneck. It is the act of taking a vital resource entirely out of circulation.
Exactly. A healthy economy is a circulatory system. Capital absolutely must flow to the extremities, like the working class, the innovators, the infrastructure, for the organism to survive.
Right.
But these societies build what the text calls artificial systems. They apply tourniquets.
They restrict the flow.
Yes, they write exclusionary laws, they form monopolies, they create class structures that artificially override the natural flow of resources, and they just pool everything at the top.
Let me put a modern framework on this just to see if the mechanics really hold up.
Go for it.
It's like, imagine a massive multinational corporation buying up all the essential patents in a specific industry.
Okay, good example.
They don't buy them to build better products. They buy them just to bury them, to cover them up so no one else can innovate and threaten their dominance.
Which is literal kufr in the linguistic sense.
Right. They are hoarding the potential of the entire market. And what happens? The entire industry stagnates. The velocity of money drops. The system eventually rots from the inside out because the circulation of ideas and capital has been artificially choked off.
That is a perfect structural analogy. And the text points to historical data to prove that this artificial choking is the primary vector for collapse.
It mentions specific civilizations.
It cites civilizations like Alad and Thamud. And the crucial variable the text highlights here is that these were not impoverished nations.
They weren't struggling.
Not at all. They did not collapse because of a famine or a lack of production. The Arabic word used to describe their state is mashat.
Mashat. What does that imply?
It indicates excessive, abundant livelihoods.
So they had incredible GDPs. They had the ancient equivalent of soaring stock markets and massive infrastructure.
They had unprecedented wealth. But their velocity of money was artificially reduced to basically zero by the elites at the top.
Because they hoarded it all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the macroeconomic result. The source material describes how their magnificent cities became empty, unlit ruins.
Man.
The lecture we're analyzing uses this haunting Persian phrase to describe this end state. Rachegi Beydud.
Rocky baited. What does that mean?
It means a lamp without smoke.
Oh.
It signifies utter desolation. They hoarded so much wealth that they didn't even have the oil left to light a single lamp.
Okay, let's walk through the exact mechanics of that deflationary spiral, because I think it's vital for you listening to understand this.
Let's do it.
You have this hyper-concentrated wealth at the top, right? The elites are producing goods, but they've completely starved the base of the economy.
Right.
So the working class has no capital. And if the working class has no capital, they physically cannot buy the goods the elites are producing.
The man creators.
Exactly. Demand craters. The factory is shut down. The infrastructure crumbles because there is literally no tax base left to maintain it. The society starves itself to death while surrounded by hoarded gold.
You've just described the dual punishment the text outlines for this systemic hoarding. Hunger and fear.
Hunger and fear.
It is a mathematical certainty.
Yeah.
Even when there is technically enough food or wealth within the city walls, the artificial distribution means the vast majority experience hunger.
And the minority at the top.
Yeah.
The ones doing the hoarding.
They experience constant, paralyzing fear.
Because they know they are sitting on a powder keg.
Exactly. They know their wealth isn't generated by a healthy system. It's extracted from a dying one.
Right. So they have to build higher walls.
They hire more private security. And they live in constant paranoia that the artificial dam they built is just going to burst.
And in the moment you have to militarize your own society just to maintain your wealth, you have fundamentally destroyed the Haram Aminan, the secure sanctuary.
You no longer have a safe hub. Not when the internal mechanics are defined by exploitation and suppression. The fear and the hunger are the inevitable outputs of a hoarded economy.
Okay, this brings up a really critical structural question for me.
Sure, what is it?
If an entire civilization is a complex network, where does this fatal error actually originate? Because a society doesn't just wake up one day and decide to choke itself to death. The rot has to start somewhere.
That brings us to one of the most sophisticated systems engineering concepts in the entire text. It's found in verse 59.
Okay, what is it?
The capital city principle. The text explicitly states an empirical rule of network failure. It says, we do not destroy cities until we send a messenger to their central hub. Or, in Arabic, al-Qura.
Al-Qura, the mother of cities, the metropolis.
Yes, the policymaking center. If you visualize a civilization as a vast, interconnected network of nodes, the text is arguing that systemic collapse doesn't originate in the small, peripheral farming villages.
Right, because a localized failure at the edge of a network can be quarantined or routed around.
Exactly. But the fatal, unrecoverable errors, those are generated at the central node.
So it's not a simple corporate metaphor where, like, a bad middle manager brings down the whole company.
No, it's bigger than that.
Think of it like a global server network, right? If a peripheral routing station in a small town goes offline, the internet just reroutes the traffic. It's no big deal.
But the network survives.
But if the central routing hub, the al-Qura, has a corrupted algorithm baked into its core software, every single packet of data it sends out poisons the rest of the network.
Oh, that's a brilliant way to put it.
The central hub is actively generating the failure.
That is exactly the dynamic. The unjust economic policies, the artificial systems of distribution, the legal protection of monopolies, the institutionalized coup for hoarding, they are all manufactured at the center of gravity.
Because that is where the laws are written and the ledgers are kept.
Exactly. Therefore, any attempt at reform or any warning of systemic collapse absolutely must be directed at that central node.
And the text mentions sending a messenger to this central hub.
It does.
And the source lecture points out something incredibly rational here. Warnings are always sent before a systemic collapse because ignorance of the law is no excuse.
Right.
The system never just spontaneously combusts without notifying the operators.
It is an empirical law of socioeconomics.
Oh.
A fundamentally unbalanced system will always generate critical error messages before it hits terminal failure.
Error messages. I love that.
Yeah. If you have an economy built on hoarded wealth, the friction of that hoarding will produce heat. You will see the warning signs.
Like what?
Widening wealth gaps, localized civil unrest, increasing market volatility, the breakdown of basic municipal services.
See, I love looking at it this way. The messengers in this context don't have to be literal prophets standing in a public square with a scroll.
No, not at all.
When we view this through a systems lens, the messengers are the data points. The messengers are the inflation reports, the labor strikes, the supply chain breakdowns, the climate indicators. They are the red flags screaming at the policymakers in the central hub saying, your artificial system is mathematically unsustainable.
And dealing with those messengers requires the people at the central hub to engage in objective analysis. It requires a full audit.
But what is their historical default reaction?
Well, they fall back on the exact excuse we discussed from verse 57. They say, if we change course, if we dismantle our artificial system, we'll lose our position.
Right. So they shoot the messenger.
Or they suppress the data
Yeah.
because they refuse to acknowledge that their exclusionary policies are the actual source of the instability.
It is just staggering to me how modern this ancient text is.
It's timeless.
It's arguing that civilizational collapse isn't some random punishment dropped from the sky by an angry deity. It is the delayed, inevitable, and fully predictable result of central policy failures that were clearly warned about but deliberately ignored.
It's a systemic audit.
Yes, an audit.
An audit is the perfect term because the text explicitly frames the aftermath of this failure as an accounting reckoning. In verses 60 and 61, the text shifts the conversation to the ultimate contrast in wealth management.
Okay, where does it go?
It introduces the law of requital, or mukafat-e-amal, and it frames this law as a strict analysis of two distinct asset classes.
Okay, let's really break down these asset classes because, again, I think it's easy for people to misread this as a demand for poverty.
Right, which it isn't.
The text introduces the concept of the fleeting enjoyment of this life. The Arabic word is mata,
Maka.
and it contrasts that with what is better and more enduring, khairun wa abka. But we need to be very clear here for the listener. The source material is absolutely not saying that wealth or technology or high standards of living are inherently evil, right?
Correct. The text is not demanding asceticism. It is not saying you have to live in a cave and reject material progress to be righteous.
So what is it saying?
It is strictly a question of portfolio outcome and systemic solvency. Mata refers to short-term volatile extraction.
Short-term extraction.
Yeah. It is the wealth gained by the exact mechanisms we just discussed: hoarding, rigging the system, and exploiting the artificial distribution network.
So MATA yields a massively high immediate return. It's like the sugar rush of the economy.
It provides fleeting enjoyment, yes, but it is structurally unsound. It depreciates rapidly because the very act of extracting it destroys the underlying society that gives it value.
Wow. It's the ultimate parasitic asset.
Exactly.
It's like an executive gutting a company's research and development budget, firing half the staff, and using the saved cash to do massive stock buybacks.
That is a perfect modern example of MATA.
Right. Because, sure, the stock price spikes today. The executive exercises their options and walks away with a multi-million-dollar bonus today. That is MATA.
But 5 years from now,
5 years from now, the company has no new products, the institutional knowledge is completely gone, the market share collapses, and the whole enterprise goes bankrupt. It was a short-term extraction that fundamentally destroyed long-term value.
and that is exactly how MATA operates on a civilizational scale.
So what about the other asset class?
The other asset class is Kaiwun wa Abka, the better and more enduring. And this represents an investment in the long-term solvency of a just system.
Okay.
It is wealth that is circulated, not hoarded. It is capital deployed to build resilient infrastructure, to ensure equitable access to markets, to maintain the Haraman Amanan, the secure sanctuary.
So it's building a foundation.
It is an investment in the system's capacity to perpetually generate prosperity rather than cannibalizing it for a quarterly gain.
And the text actually sets up two distinct trajectories for two different actors based on how they manage these assets, right? Verse 61 presents this contrast incredibly starkly.
It does.
Let's look at the first actor.
So the first actor is promised a good promise which he will meet. In systems terms, this means they have invested in the enduring asset class.
The Kairun wa Abka.
Exactly. They have aligned their economic actions with the natural, equitable flow of the system. Their promise is the mathematical certainty that a just, circulated economy will remain solvent and continue to provide for them. They are building on a foundation of bedrock.
And the second actor. The one who bets everything on the extractive model.
The second actor extracts maximum short-term value. The text says they are given the enjoyment of worldly life. But then it notes they are summoned on the day of reckoning.
The ultimate audit.
Yes.
The day of reckoning. If we strip away the purely theological lens, what does that mean mechanically for a society?
Mechanically, the day of reckoning is the exact moment the systemic bill finally comes due. Is the moment the artificial system collapses under the impossible weight of its own hoarding.
Right.
It's the catastrophic market crash. It's the French Revolution. It's the moment the city literally goes dark because the supply chains have completely severed.
So if you bet your entire civilizational portfolio on short-term extraction, on MATA, You are left holding a massively depreciated, essentially toxic asset when that systemic account is finally called.
Yes.
The system crashes, and your hoarded wealth becomes mathematically meaningless because the society that gave your currency value no longer exists. I mean, $1 billion in hoarded cash is just paper if the civilization around you has burned to the ground.
And that is the ultimate bitter irony of the Quraysh's objection back in verse 57.
How so?
They were so terrified of losing their short-term mata, their immediate artificial monopoly on the trade routes, that they adamantly refused to invest in the Khairun wa Abka, the enduring security of a just, integrated regional system.
Wow.
They chose a fragile hoarded wealth over a robust, circulated prosperity, and in doing so, they engineered their own obsolescence.
It is a profound choice between fleeting extraction and enduring solvency. And what continues to floor me is how perfectly this ancient text diagnoses the exact operational disease that plagues almost every modern institution we interact with today.
Which brings us right to the synthesis of this entire analysis. The permanent principle we've uncovered here is universally applicable.
Right.
The deepest, most stubborn resistance to a just, equitable order is rarely about genuine philosophy, religion, or values. It is almost always economic self-interest wearing an ideological mask.
It's a CEO claiming we are just protecting our corporate culture. No, you are protecting your profit margins, and your exclusionary culture is the artificial system keeping those margins high at the expense of everyone else in the building.
Exactly. And this resistance rests entirely on a fundamental, unproven assertion, a false belief that justice inherently costs you your livelihood.
That equity destroys the economy.
Right, that you can only be truly safe if someone else is kept vulnerable.
And while the specific variables change over the centuries, right? I mean, the type of currencies used, the geographic territories fought over, the level of technology deployed to hoard the wealth.
Well, that changed.
But the core reflex remains absolutely identical. The panic of, oh no, we will be ruined if we reform. That is a completely universal human reaction among comfortable classes.
And the brilliance of Surah Al-Qasas verses 57 to 61 is that it successfully preempts and dismantles the oldest excuse of every elite class in human history.
Yes.
It proves both logically and through empirical historical modeling that justice doesn't cost a civilization its livelihood. A secure sanctuary naturally attracts provision.
Rather, it is the absence of justice, the deliberate hoarding of wealth, and the creation of artificial monopolies that actually guarantees eventual bankruptcy. It's an incredible framework we've walked through today. We completely bypass the traditional mystical readings to discover a razor-sharp, rational, socioeconomic analysis of systemic stability.
We really did.
We've seen how networks fail from the top down at the Al-Qasas, how kufra acts as an economic bottleneck that starves the base. And we shattered the myth that equity destroys prosperity.
Because knowledge is most valuable when it's understood and applied. The mechanics of survival and collapse are clearly visible to us, provided we know how to read the blueprint.
So to you listening, think about the structures you operate within right now. Think about the corporate ladder you're climbing, the industry you work in, or the political policies you support.
Are the leaders at the top building a secure sanctuary for everyone?
Or are they acting exactly like the ancient Quraysh, building an artificial toll booth and hoarding the provision? Are you falling for the will be snatched away panic, or are you demanding long-term, enduring solvency?
And if we connect this to the macro level, it leaves us with a deeply critical, lingering question for everyone to think about.
What's that?
If our modern global economy is functioning essentially as a massive machine for mata, for fleeting enjoyment built on hoarded assets, artificial monopolies, and aggressive short-term extraction, what happens when the secure sanctuary of our global trade network finally realizes it's mathematically bankrupt? When the data points to the messengers can no longer be ignored, and that ultimate systemic audit finally happens, what is the enduring asset you are actually left holding?
The cinematic version of collapse might feature fire and earthquakes, but the reality is just a spreadsheet slowly turning red until one day the lights simply go out. See you next time on The Deep Dive.